Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Naama Klar. I'm the managing director of the Reut Institute, an Israeli think and do tank. We try to tackle the strategic problems of the state of Israel and the Jewish people that suffers from a blind spot, from some sort of a neglectance, off-radar kind of a problems. And today we're going to discuss one of those issues, which is the Israeli-American community. For years, a neglected community, an issue that no one had spoke about, definitely not in a strategic way. But today, as we see here in this huge, amazing conference, an existing phenomenon, a growing phenomenon, that can be a strategic asset both for the state of Israel and the Jewish people. And there are really interesting trends of numerical and quantitative trends that are taking place today here in the US. And we're going to discuss it with our honorable speakers today. I'm going to start with reading a poem. It's a Hebrew poem written by Leah Goldberg, which I'm sure you all heard of. Because the words, the lyrics are so beautiful, I'm going to read it first in Hebrew and then the English translation. כאן לא אשמע את קול הקוקייה. כאן לא יחבוש העץ מצנפת שלג, אבל בצל האורנים האלה, כל ילדותי שקמה לתחייה. צלצול המחטים היו היה, אקרא מולדת למרחב השלג, לקרח ירקרק קובל הפלג, ללשון השיר בארץ נוכריה. אולי רק ציפורי מסע יודעות כשהן תלויות בין ארץ ושמיים, את זה הכאב של שתי המולדות. איתכם אני נשתלתי פעמיים, איתכם אני צמחתי אורנים, ושורשיי בשני נופים שונים. English version, not as good as, but here I will not hear the voice of the cuckoo. Here the tree will not wear a cup of snow. But it is here, in the shade of these pines, my whole childhood reawakens. The chime of the needles, once upon a time, I call the snow-spaced homeland. And the green ice at the river edge was the poem grammar in the foreign place. Perhaps only the migrating birds know, suspended between earth and sky, the heartache of the two homelands. With you I was transplanted twice, with you pine trees I grew, roots in two desperate landscapes. So we have two immigrants in this song. The first one is Leah Goldberg, that had moved her life from Minsk to Israel. And who knows who the second immigrant is? It's the pine trees. It's not an Israeli tree at all. It was brought from Europe and was planted massively in Israel. Today it's a part of the Israeli landscape, but it's actually a migrant, ole, like Leah Goldberg to Israel. And I think this very unique phenomenon of dual identity, of roots in two different landscapes, is something that today characterizes many of the Israelis who's chosen to live here in the US. And I would like to present our speakers now, which is going to, together with me, going to try and discuss the uniqueness of the phenomenon and what can be done today with this amazing asset of the Israeli community in America. So, Shawn Evenhaim is an IAC board member and the chairman Emeritus in the IAC. Professor Leonard Saxe is the director of the Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies and the Steinhardt Social Research Institute. Steve Rakitt is the president of Genesis Prize Foundation, based now in New York. Am I correct? And last but not least, Mr. Barry Shrage, the president of SAJP in Greater Washington Jewish Federation.
Boston.
Boston.
You moved?
Now you move.
I ain't moving.
I promised an intimate session, so let me just start with some questions, and you can just raise your hand if you agree with what I say. Do you feel that you're a part of the Jewish people? Yes. Just raise your hand if you agree. I think we have the room with us.
It's a test.
Do you feel that you're an Israeli American? More than 50%, I say. Are you attending any Jewish institution, which is not an Israeli institution, at least once in a month here in the US? Impressive numbers. So we're going to reflect on that at the end of the session, but I want to start now with maybe asking Professor Saxe to tell us a bit about the phenomenon of this Israeli community here, and how does it correlate with the numbers we've just seen here in the room?
Well, this room is obviously not representative of the American Jewish scene. But my quick comment is about the title of this session, 10%. So I don't know whether it's good news or bad news, but actually it's a very Jewish thing, it's both. It's probably not near 10%, it's probably closer to 5% the population, the Israeli population in America. But in some ways, even a small group may be very, very important. American Jews are a little over 2% of the American Jewish population, but they play an oversized role in everything from intellectual, economic, social, political affairs. And I think one of the interesting things, and by the way, one of the reasons that we know that the number is not quite 10%, is that only slightly more than 10% of Jews in America can have a conversation b'Ivrit. And we know while the illiteracy of American Jews with respect to Hebrew is very high, we know that it's not quite 100%, that there are some American Jews who can have a conversation. And I think it is possible, and I think it is important, and I think it is already the case that whether it's 500,000 or whether it's 600,000 Israeli Americans, B'Artzot Habrit, play an exceptionally important role.
Thank you. I have a question to refer to all of our speakers this morning, and I think we can use this intimate session maybe to have a real conversation about this issue, because there are challenges in integrating the Israelis that lives here within the Jewish community. And I would like to hear if you can share from your own experience, how do you see this challenge? What is blocking us? What is making it hard for us to make the Israelis that live in America join with the existing Jewish community here? Maybe Mr. Shrage would like to begin?
So part of it is just human nature. You watch kids in high school and they sit at the table with their friends. And the American Jewish community always built neighborhoods out of the ethnic groups that came to this country together, and they wanted to live with people who they could talk to and who they were like. So that's just kind of, I don't think it's a conspiracy. I think it's just kind of natural. The reason this needs to be overcome, and the reason that it's so important, is that sooner or later we will share a common fate. Rabbi Soloveitchik used to like to talk about fate and destiny. We have a choice. Either we can give into fate, which will mean sooner or later the complete assimilation of the American Jewish community, including the Israelis who are in it, or we can decide to learn from each other, figure out what our strengths are, and then struggle together to define something, entirely new. And this is the same, it's the same issue with birthright. It's the same issue with anything that provides a real mifgash between American Jews and Israelis is going to be a positive thing. Now, the thing that was one of the blocks that was keeping federations and other such institutions from being able to engage Israelis is that we can't do that. That's why IAC is such a miraculous phenomenon. What happened in Boston was Israelis came into our offices and said, we want to be part of this thing. So, you'd really have to be stupid to say, oh, no, we really don't want you around here. So it offered great opportunities. The programs that IAC creates are exactly the programs that need to be created in order to, number one, bring people in, but number two, to create this dialogue around what our common future will be. So you look at the American Jewish community, try to say this very briefly, look at the American Jewish community, look at the Israel and what we have for each other. So the reason that birthright is so important, and the reason why CJP's program in Haifa, which is a deep, deep, deep partnership program, is important, is because Israel teaches American Jews something that we are rapidly forgetting, and that Israelis will forget sooner or later as well, which is that we are a people, and our love for each other, our caring for each other, is just as important as going to synagogue to pray, or just as important as studying Jewish culture, both of which I completely believe in. But without this sense of connection to each other, we don't have it. And Israel is where we learn that. On the other hand, the American Jewish community has struggled in the diaspora for long and hard, and has some lessons to teach about how we can hold on to our identity, both Israelis living in America and even perhaps something to teach to Israelis living in Israel, where some parts of Jewish identity have been cut off because they have been basically destroyed by the Rabbanut that seeks to destroy any possible love for Jewish religious life, and they've done a pretty good job of it.
I think what Mr. Shrage is referring to is to major differences in the structure of Jewish communities outside of Israel and the Jewish communities within Israel that has a system, like a bureaucratic system that supports Jewish life, which create huge differences, and the differences aren't an outcome of like some vicious attention, but at the end of the day, there are advantages that each other has and we can learn from each other. Am I representing what you've said correctly? Awesome. We're going to have time for Q&As at the end of the session, so please write it down, and I'm going to give you a cue to go to this mic and ask your question. Is that okay? Mr. Rakitt, would you like to share how you see the challenge?
Sure. I agree with Barry's formulation. I think there are two specific reasons why we have not yet been successful in integrating the two communities. The first is we have to remember that the Israelis living here are part of the first generation of immigrants. And if you look at any immigrant population that comes into our country, and probably also in Israel and elsewhere, is that first generation immigrants behave differently. They're building, they're more cautious, they want to find one another. They're not quite ready to step out and be a part of something else. They save more, they give less. All those kinds of patterns are similar for any immigrant population, and I think they're the same for Israelis that are here now as first generation Israelis. The second is a very different formulation, I think you're right, on the need for community. I once had a conversation with an Israeli living in the community, and I talked about the federation and the community and so forth, and the woman looked at me as if I had two heads. She says, you know, when I lived in Israel, I have my army unit, I have my place of work, I have my neighborhood. I don't need more community. Why do you push this community thing? I don't understand. And then I began to realize that we're really talking two different languages. Because in the American Jewish community, we talk about consciously coming together and building community. For the Israeli, it seemed to be an unnecessary add-on. We're now beginning to have conversations with Israeli Americans about the need to build community for their children. And we'll come back to that, I'm sure, later on.
That's really interesting. You've just lit a point that I might ask before giving Professor Saxe the opportunity to respond. I guess most of you are leaving here since you've raised your hands. Have you felt uncomfortable when the Kotel Compromise plan was annulled at June 25th? If you did, just raise your hand. It doesn't matter if you agreed or disagreed, just if you felt uncomfortable with it. Okay, I can pretty fairly tell you that if we were in an Israeli room, the numbers were different. I would just like, I'd ask this in order for Professor Saxe to maybe just reflect a bit on it, because maybe the challenge, we can feel it from different angles today.
So for me, to talk about this is to think about the broader context, what else is going on in the world and how we see ourselves. And I think there's a generational issue. To use a metaphor that Sherry Turkle, the sociologist, has used, that identity today is like Microsoft Windows, where you have all of these programs on your desktop, and you can actually run 3 or 4 of them, or 5 or 6 of them at a time. And it's actually, and I think this is particularly so for millennials, for young people, those people under, as my definition now, under 40 years of age, thinking of yourself as more than one thing, whether it's gender or religion or it's ethnicity or what have you, is au courant. It's how you do it. And so I think For younger people in particular, Israelis who are here, it is a much more natural thing to think of yourself as an American and an Israeli, and not to see it simply as a conflict, that you can do both of those things. And I think one of the problems historically is that Israelis who come to America, it's always temporary. Adam was describing it last night. He came for school, and then he finished school, and just will pay off the loans for school and stay another year, and then another year became another year, and I think he said he's been here 37 years. And so if you're doing that, if you're temporary in a position, why invest in a community, whatever your definition of it is? And I think now, partially because it's more accepted to be in two places at once and to have multiple identities, I guess I think of these things not as problems, as opportunities, and perhaps as challenges for us to figure out how to support. And that's why I think, turning to Shawn, that's why I think IAC is so important, because it gives people the opportunity to engage in this. The fact that there are close to 3,000 people here is an extraordinary opportunity to enact the multiple identities that people have.
That's really fascinating. If it's okay with you, Mr. Evenhaim, I would like to sharpen the question a little bit. You're one
So I
of the-
prepared for this one?
especially prepared for you. Since you've been active in this field, you've been an activist for like over 10 years. And I would like to ask you, what was the challenge that you've started with? And is it still the challenge, or the challenge has shifted, reshaped, is different now?
So I got involved first in the Jewish American community before I got involved in the Israeli American community. So the challenges are completely different, and not because I want to give a plug to the IAC, it's because what the IAC was able to create, not just in the IAC, under the IAC umbrella, I think the IAC inspired many others to do different things around the community. But the challenges that I have seen many years ago were four. The first one is perception. There was a perception in the Jewish American community about the Israelis. I completely agree about the time even that they are here. They're temporary. Why to invest? The second thing was, and I'm not blaming anyone, this is on both sides the fault, it was our involvement and our giving and our leadership. We were not there because exactly what Professor Saxe said, we just saw ourselves as temporary. We came here, and as I said before, we are immigrants. The third thing is understanding each other. I think even up to today, that's one of the really challenges that we need to work more. And by the way, it's not the challenge of the Jewish American community, it's a challenge of the American community. If you look at what happened after the last election, we don't talk to each other anymore. We scream at each other, or we just say one word, you're an idiot or whatever, and that's the end of the conversation. How can we have a true dialogue? And the last thing is really, how do we as an immigrant community understand what it means to live in a diaspora? And Israelis that come to the United States, they think their kids will be as Jewish because they went into a special unit in the army. They'll be Israelis, they'll speak the language, they'll do all these things that they really believe in, but they do nothing to ensure that that's going to happen. So what the IAC has been able to create is really, so let's talk about the perception. First, when the individuals get involved with Jewish American communities, and that's why yesterday I was in a room with Evenhaim, which is our leadership program, and I spoke to them and I said, it doesn't matter what you choose to get involved, just get involved, and the perception will change through that. And the fact that we are able to do that, and so the perception I think is changing, and I keep telling Barry, I wish I can clone him and send him all over the US, because he's been there from the beginning, believing in what the IAC, when a lot of people said, it's going to fail. You guys are temporary here, it's not going to work, and you guys want to create your own bubble, which was completely wrong and not the true story. We wanted, and I was with Barry at the first meeting in Boston when we flew to Boston, and on purpose we went to Barry's office and we said, we want to do it with you. We don't want to come to your community and think that we know better than you know what your community needs. And that's why it's so successful in Boston.
That's actually starting to answer my next question. Which stories of success, something that actually works, can you share with us as an inspiration and maybe can be even copied in other communities and be learned by other counterparts that we have today in this conference? So you've already started talking about the success stories. Would you like to start and just elaborate a bit more about it?
Boston is an amazing story because I think it's truly because of Barry and his leadership. And if you check and ask people around Boston, you'll see what the IAC, it's one of our most successful office there. And our community really integrating, and there's still work, but it's great. And I can tell you that in other communities, including Los Angeles, which the IAC started, we failed so far. We're working on it, but we failed, and we failed
in what?
In integration and in creating one community. And the reason is, honestly, I'm not ashamed to say, because I'm on the board of the federation in Los Angeles, is it's leadership and egos and things that we should leave aside. We need to put the community in the middle and just work toward that target. When we do that, the success will be there. But what I've seen, the main success that I've seen in the last 10 years is, one, the change in the perception from Israel to the Israeli Americans. But more than that, seeing when I go to galas in Los Angeles and there is an FIDF and JNF and Stand With Us and AJC, you see Israelis there in leadership position. You see them making substantial contribution and donations. And that's where, you want to lead, you need to set an example. And I think that's the biggest success that I've seen, is how many leaders, and again, it's not about the IAC. There were other things before us. I think there were great things. But I think the IAC was able to really give it a major boost to showcase that our community is here to stay, and our community is a strategic asset, not just to the state of Israel, but to the Jewish American community.
Professor Saxe.
I don't have specific success stories, although I guess I'd like to highlight one other area in which I think Israeli Americans have contributed to the Jewish community, but actually at large. The presence of and the success of Israeli Americans here in the United States has, in a strange sense, and I'm going to put it in quotes, air quotes, normalized being Israeli, and has exposed American Jews and American non-Jews to Israel in a way that, if the only knowledge you have of what Israel is what you read in the newspaper, then you don't understand what is going on in Israel. And I think there's been a phenomenal shift. I see it in the academy, in universities and campuses across the country, and with young people who have been exposed to Israeli American professors and students. And it gives them an entirely different take on what Israel is. And I think it's particularly important for Jewish Americans who, if they haven't visited Israel, or if they visited Israel and through five-star hotels, don't really have an understanding of Israel.
This is actually quite fascinating, because what you're saying is that the Israeli American community here can serve as a living bridge between the state of Israel and the Jewish communities here, in a time that we know that it's highly needed. So you say that you already see it in the academy and in the knowledge exchange scene, and I think this is very promising, just to hear that it's already going on. Mr. Rakitt.
Yeah, it was left out of my bio, but before I began with the Genesis Prize Foundation in August, I was with the Federation in Washington, D.C. As the CEO. And when we began the IAC chapter in Washington, I think 2 to 3 years ago, we looked around the country at examples of what worked and what didn't work. And of course, Boston was one that was working, and others were not as successful. And we certainly wanted to end up in the camp of the successful ones. So we immediately began conversations that included making sure that the IAC office was in the Federation building, that they were colleagues, that they would meet serendipitously and purposefully in the hallway and meeting room to coordinate. We created partnerships in the community with agencies, most particularly the JCC. And going back to what I said earlier about first generation, what's critical, I believe, is that the Israeli-American community come together first and form its own identity. And that's what the JCC in Washington, in Rockville, was purposely trying to do. And they created an Israeli center within the center. And they co-brand on all kinds of programming. And they run programs with Jewish American and Israeli American teenagers together, talking about one another, talking about the differences and the similarities. And the most powerful attribute, I believe, that the Israeli American community brings is, in fact, a strong connection to Israel and a strong knowledge of the real Israel, not the textbook, not what we learned in Hebrew school many years ago, but what's happening today in Israel. That's a critical piece for this dialogue that's necessary, and that's how we have to work to make sure there's full integration.
Is there a difference while trying to work with the parents that left Israel and trying to work with the second generation, those who were already born here or were brought here as children?
There is a difference. That's why I mentioned that the JCC center within a center is mostly for the parents. But for the teen, they don't really want that. They want to be with other teens. And so that sort of bifurcated approach is what we saw was working well in Washington.
Does the same solutions and programs that are attractive for the general Jewish teens in the US are as attractive to the second generations of Israelim, of Israeli Americans?
I hate to paint it with a broad brush. I think the quick answer is yes. But I think there's also a need to build identity among the second generation of Israelis. And that's what their parents are looking for, right? They're looking for opportunities to speak Hebrew. They're looking for opportunities for that generation not to lose their connection to Israel. So I think we've got to be careful, and I would leave that to the programming agencies, the JCC, for example, and the IAC itself, the local chapters, to make those kinds of decisions, because I think it's different.
That's really interesting. Shawn,
So
would like
I
to-
will just say, as the only Israeli American on the panel, is if any Israeli American thinks that their kids will be Israeli or Israeli Americans only, they're completely wrong. I have three boys, and I can tell you you're wrong. They probably, if you do the right thing, they probably will be more connected to Israel. They'll speak the language than the average American Jew. But if you think they're going to be like you, you're completely wrong. And that's something that our community need to understand and work on. But one more point to what Professor Saxe said is I tell wherever I see young Israeli Americans, we are ambassadors of the state of Israel, if you like it or not. And it doesn't matter if you're, by the way, if you're Israeli too, if you travel in South America and you climb a mountain with Germans and English and people from Australia, you're an ambassador of Israel. You don't have to say anything. Just because they know you're from Israel and they get a perception now completely, or they see the real story different than the perception they got, you're an ambassador. And we all know how many Israelis travel. And as Israeli Americans, the same thing applies to us. Whatever we do here in the United States, we are ambassadors, and we are the one that's going to make the change of the perception.
Mr. Shrage, it looks like every time they talk about success, they pinpoint you.
Yeah, well, that's because I listened to the IAC. There's no special wisdom here. I mean, what several of you were saying was absolutely true. We can't make these plans, and our agencies frequently can't make these plans either. We had exceptional IAC leadership, exceptional, easy to deal with, easy to talk to, giving credit, no one caring where the credit went, and therefore we were able to be supportive of. It seemed like Naama was adding a new innovation and a new innovative project every other day, and all we could do was say, hooray, and this is great, let's do what we can to be supportive and helpful. There was just a lot of energy. You've got a very educated group of Israelis in Boston. You've got scientists, technical people. It's a pleasure, and once that energy is brought within as part of some partnership with the American Jewish community, you can do anything. The Israeli community was an integral part of our governor's trip to Israel to bring business from Israel to Boston. When we first started making business happen with Israel, we had to beg American companies to go to Israel. Now, all of a sudden, everybody's knocking down the door. Please, how can we get a piece of this Israeli technology and all that? So we've got all of the elements for success. The thing is that, look, you know, talking about the teenage stuff, we're not doing great with our teenagers. This is nothing to write home about. We're struggling. Sooner or later, all of this stuff will merge together. Our sociologists tell us that in the third or fourth generation of freedom, ethnic connections disappear. Now, that's never exactly happened with Jews, and we've done better than that. I actually believe that we would have succumbed if it wasn't for our passion after the '67 war, which brought Jews all over the world to their feet, which was an amazing transformational experience. I like to say that I would walk to school with a yarmulke on my head, and if somebody called me a dirty yellow Jew, I could just like slink away. I wasn't going to fight. But after the '67, and by the way, you weren't going to run to ADL either with a story about somebody calling you a dirty Jew. But huh? JDL. Yeah, well, they might have helped, but that would have caused other kinds of problems. But but after the '67 war, somebody might call you a dirty Jew. They never called you a dirty yellow Jew again, because we inherited, because of Israelis' blood, sweat, and tears, we inherited a certain kind of pride. It broke the back of assimilation for a period of time. But inevitably, you have to come down from that kind of a high. And that's what happened over many, many, many years. You have the '73 war, the oil boycott, the assault on Israel at the UN and elsewhere. And the truth is that once again, Israel is providing some magic for us. That's what birthright is. And that's what the connection in local communities, one of our basic tenets was to take all the money we were given to Israel and only put it in projects that were joint project between Israelis and Americans in Israel. So we weren't the big philanthropists, and they weren't the poor Israelis taking our charity. But that kind of a change of attitude is essential across the board. The more connections you make, the more mifgash there is, the more we can join together to solve our common problem, which is essentially a problem about Jewish identity.
So just to sum it, yeah.
So I just want to make a comment. It's very easy in these discussions to see, if you will, causality going in one direction, but it's an interaction, it's an interdependency. And so the success of Israeli Americans is in part dependent on where the American Jewish community is. The success of the American Jewish community is dependent on where Israel is. And I think it's reflected in our families today, that increasingly families include connections to families on both sides of the ocean, and differences, Russian speaking, all sorts of combinations. And I think that has created, again, in my positive frame of reference, that's created a gazillion new set of opportunities to deepen these connections.
So just to sum it up, we're experiencing today a new era of the Jewish people, and within this context, the Israeli American has a new role. What you shared with us today is that it all comes down to leadership. If you invest in good leadership that can lead those ventures in order to bring those communities together to be one, it also might be a bridge into the community in Israel as well. Just trying to sum it up in a paintbrush.
Except that my only amendment to your comment would be, you read the literature on leadership. Leadership is also about followership. And leaders reflect where their followers are. And so some of the things that Barry has been able to do and other communities have been able to do in integrating IAC happened because IAC, there was a groundswell of interest in promoting the Jewish and Israel identity of Yisraelim.
But it's not just about leadership. It's the right leadership. There is leadership all over the U.S. There are places that we were able to integrate it from the beginning, and there are places that we're not able. And again, I'm blaming both sides. I'm not saying one, it's the Israeli Americans or the Jewish Americans. So it's having the right leadership and coming from the same place that Barry and we came together, at the same level putting the community and saying, how can we do it better together? Because there are things that we are great at, and there are things that the Jewish Americans are great at. Together, we have this spatial sauce, which is an unbelievable formula for the future of the Jewish people. How can we use that formula? But you need the right leadership in the right place.
And also the future leadership that you have to invest today in order to have it tomorrow.
Yeah, I just want to, we'll continue to amend your statement. It'll start short and it'll end up with 3 paragraphs. But to me, yes, it's leadership, and it's the right leadership. But it's listenership. It's the ability to actually hear one another that we're losing. We're absolutely losing that ability in the United States, in the American Jewish community. And so when a new group, whatever it is, it's IAC or some other group, come to community leadership, it's critical that leadership listen, understand what the challenges are, and figure out a way to help, figure out a way to be supportive. At the same time, the IAC, we had some very constructive conversations in Washington. They had certain ideas, they wanted to do it. We said, you know what, that may not work. As my grandmother would say, "Geh gesund to hate" in Yiddish. Go ahead, go ahead and try it. But we had a feeling it wasn't going to work, and they came back to us about a year later and said, you were right. We needed to try, we needed to fail. Now tell us more about what you said earlier. So it's the ability to listen that I think is critical to success.
Just to add to it, you asked about success stories. This is so true because the IAC, when it started to expand from Los Angeles, we did not think that we knew what Miami needs and what Boston needs or what Washington needs. We brought the Israeli American community into the room and the Jewish American community where we could. And we listened to them, exactly what was said here. And I think that's why we have great success in some places. And the places that we couldn't bring the Jewish American community into the discussion, we didn't have the same success. So it's very important to make sure that you open the tent for everyone and have a discussion with everyone.
Thank you so much for this amendments, because now I understand something very important. It's not about leadership only. You also have to have a channel of communication, some sort of a shared language that you can evolve together through. And just giving the foundations for this language is an important, hard, long task to do. I think the IAC is taking it upon themselves in many places in the US. And I think this conference is kind of a proof of concept to the attempt of bringing the people together. And I've been here for the 3rd year now. It's keep growing. It's becoming more and more significant. And on that note, I would ask my last question, which is an optimistic one, and we'll open the floor for Q&As. So my question is, how would you describe the successful integration of the Israeli Americans here within the Jewish communities? What would the joint future look like from your perspective? Maybe, Mr. Shrage, would you like to start?
Do you want to give them a chance?
Yeah, why don't you give them
For
a
the
chance?
Q&As before the
Yeah.
okay, let's start with the Q&As. Yeah, but just when you ask your question, please go just to the mic so we can hear you, okay?
Just grab the mic and move it around the room.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Yael. I'm from New York. I'm married to American Jew, so from day one I was dealing with my son's tri-identity, Israeli-American Jew, and helping in any way and shape with his Jewish school, Schechter and Heschel. And in the recent years I joined IAC involved and just finished the Gvanim program. And I want to reinforce what Shawn said, which was beautifully programmed, but also mentioned join or help or anywhere you want to volunteer, whether it in the community. So recently I joined the UJA, and I wanted to say I'm learning now the UJA, and I see that they have their own program, Israeli American has their own program, and I'm very jealous sitting here hearing the success of Boston, the collaboration between IOC and the UJA Federation, and I want to know how can we bring this to New York? What can we do in New York to expand this program?
So first, the success is not only in Boston. Boston was just Just so smooth sailing from day one. We had success, and we have success in Washington. We do have success in New York now, because we're doing a lot of programs with the Federation there, and I can share with you some of them, but we have a lot of joint programs that we're doing together. Where we failed is where it's really, we talked about leadership, it was leadership. It was never the community. It was where leaders said, we know better. Either we go, oh, this is so genius what you guys doing. We're going to start our own Israeli desk. And it didn't work. It didn't work anywhere yet. The reason is it's not because we are smarter or better. We know how to communicate with our community. That's how simple it is. And I think that like in DC, like in Boston, like in New York now, in New Jersey, which we sit in the JCC, in many other places, as soon as they realize, you know, this is the conduit to get to this community, and they're a part of our community, we were able to achieve all our goals.
Go ahead.
Hi. I wanted to go back a little bit to the demographics. So I had two questions. One is, how does one define what an Israeli American is? And how did the number of 600,000 or double that, how is that number derived? What's the methodology?
So without making this a lecture on demography, it's very hard in America because we don't keep good statistics about lots of things, and this is one of them. If you look at Pew, the 2013 national study, which is one of the best national studies that have been done, there were 2% of the Jews in America were born in Israel, and it's up to 4% when you consider a parent was born in Israel. Now, that is not the definition of who is an Israeli. Many obviously haven't been born in Israel. But as I said, we have this other sort of end of the continuum of speaking Hebrew, or at least having a Hebrew conversation, which is just a little bit more than 10%. Our definition when we do demographic studies of local communities is basically darkonim. Do you have an Israeli passport? And that includes American Jews who've made Aliyah and maybe have returned. It typically includes the children of Israelis, but not always, and so on. So that's the basic way in which we do it. There is some argument about how many American Jews, who is a Jew, and so if you don't know what the denominator is, it's hard to figure out, even if you know the number that goes in the numerator. But there's agreement amongst virtually every sociologist and demographer about the definitions, and under that definition right now, there are about 7.2, probably today it's 7.3, maybe even 7.4 million Jews in America, and we use these other studies to figure out what the actual percentage is.
Just to clarify how we defining them, and first we're using, no one know, and we don't know, and we're talking to Professor Saxe and others to try to do a study and really figure out what the numbers are. The government of Israel has numbers that they know how many people left, and they estimate how many went to North America, and the numbers they're using are somewhere between 600 and 800. That's the numbers that the Prime Minister has been using, the diaspora office. We count Israeli Americans as if you were born in Israel, obviously. If you're married, your spouse and your kids, we count them as Israeli Americans. And if you lived in Israel for about 5 years. So if you went to Israel, you served in the IDF, or you lived in Israel for about 5 years, you most likely speak the language, and we consider you as Israeli Americans. But really, no one knows the numbers.
I'm Ami from Washington, D.C. My parents actually made Aliyah right after the Six-Day War. I was born in Israel, lived there most of my life, and grew up going to the conservative synagogue, conservative movement, conservative youth movement, did the army with the Nachal with Noam. So I guess I have a foot on each side. And it just reminded me an anecdote from traveling in South America after the army. There was a Seder night, this was in Quito, about 300 Israelis including the council, no one knew how to lead a seder. And I did, because I grew up, with it, in a Jewish American household in Israel. And I see this as a big, when I meet Israelis here, and I say, I go to a Reform synagogue, they say, ooh, a woman rabbi, music on Shabbat, but these guys don't do anything. They go once or twice a year, and they go to Chabad. That's for them, and that's, I think, comes from Israel, where you have the Orthodox, and you have, everyone else, and they kind of alienate, you do have Reform and conservative in movements in Israel, but as we talked before, they're often marginalized, and definitely, regarding conversion, marriage, and so on. So that's just an anecdote from, speaking to a lot of Israelis who move here. And my question is, and again, I don't know if you can answer, are we talking about Jewish Israelis? Is there any information about the non-Jewish Israelis that move here? I mean, we all read, or if you know Said Kashua, he's a famous, Israeli Muslim writer. Do they just, obviously they don't associate with the Jewish organizations, do they just associate with, I guess, Palestinian American, Arab American in general? How many are they? Because I meet not as many as Jewish Israelis, but I do meet some. So I don't know if there's any information about that.
Professor?
I have just an insight, and then I'm sure you have something more knowledgeable to say. A lot of the information is within organizations that try to deal with those issues. So there are some numbers about the non-Jews that are leaving Israel to live abroad. There's one organization that's also participating in this conference called Science Abroad that is working closely with the non-Jew scientists that are leaving Israel or relocating to the US and around the world. So they have some numbers, and they are also here participating in the conference.
I'd just like to pick up on something else that you said, because I think it's important. I want to pick up on what you said about being with Israelis who, can't have their own Seder or whatever. I mean, the problem, and here's where the American Jewish community can have a sort of a positive role if we play it right and think about it in the right way. So for me, this problem is a problem of largely of the Rabbanut. In other words, they tell one lie, and then they exacerbate the problem. The lie is that only they have the keys to heaven and the only true religion. And then they make that religion so coercive and corrupt and hateful that nobody's even interested in fighting with them. Why should we fight for a thing called religion, which we know to be ugly and corrupt and coercive? That's deadly. I mean, not everyone has to believe in God or take on the ritual, but at least you have to struggle with the idea of God, and you have to struggle with the ritual. Otherwise, what are we? I mean, we need the culture, we need the love, we need all of those things. But when people come to Boston and spend some time there, they learn something interesting, which is that a woman rabbi is not a joke. A woman cantor is beautiful and spiritual. Once you learn those things, it opens other kinds of doors. The problem right now with the American Jewish community and the relationship is the critique of what's going on in Israel is, from the Reform movement, the conservative movement, is you're not respecting our rabbis. That's not a very good argument for Israelis. I mean, it does damage to the American Jewish community and the relationship, but it's not the key. The key is, can Israelis create a native Israeli manifestation of love of God, love of people, which is neither conservative nor Reform, which rejects the Haredi model? That's and it's not because you want to do us any favors. It's because if you don't do it, you're losing something essential from your own identity as Jewish people. So you're depriving your children of something, that could be potentially important.
And one of the beauties of this country is that diversity. You have Reconstruction,
Right.
and gay synagogues, and so on. And I mean, in New York, there's like a Buddhist synagogue. You have so many things that you just don't have in Israel, and Israelis mostly don't participate.
But it's our responsibility, us, you, me, and all of us in this room and in our communities, is to, when I came to this country, it was very awkward for me. I came from a very secular home, but it was weird. On Shabbat, I drive the car and I light fire and I'll do everything, but for Shabbat, use a microphone in synagogue? Are you crazy? But I learned to explain to my friends and my community that this is how they practice their Judaism. And it's good, because you know what? If they won't practice it this way, most likely they won't practice it at all. So this is something that we have to educate our community in, And this is something that that's why I said there is so much we can learn from each other. And most of the Israeli Americans that live here are secular. They're not religious at all, but it's very awkward for them. So I agree with you, but I think it's really our job to educate them.
I think it's more fundamental than religious practice. I think Washington, we built a very robust mishlachat of shlichim. And the most common expression that they all give us after 2 or 3 years of service in the community is, I came as an Israeli, I'm going home as a Jew. Why? Because what they're learning is that, A, the American Jewish community has to put energy into its identity. It doesn't come naturally, because left to its own devices, we become just like every other American. So the American Jewish experience is about experimentation and taking affirmative action, if you will, to Jewish identity. It could be religious practice, it could be secular, it could be cultural, it could be gastronomic, it could be all kinds of expression of identity, but it takes energy and effort to do that. For Israelis, in the secular realm, it takes no energy. You don't have to do anything affirmatively to declare yourself as a Jew. You just are, and if you forget, you've got a bunch of Arab nations around you that remind you, right? So to me, it's creating pathways that are not only about religious expression, although that's critical, but are about engaging people in ways that are positive and life-affirming, as Barry said, about love of one another and about support of one another in a community that cares. And we can do that in many different ways here.
So I want to second Steve's comment about the identity Israeli Jewish. I studied Birthright Israel, Taglit, and one of the most profound findings is that the Israelis, most of them are Chayalim, when they do it, who participate in Taglit, go in as Yisraelim, they come out as Yehudim. It's just extraordinary. I also want to just quickly say the comment about the Seder in Quito. I can't get it out of my head. This summer, checking off my bucket list, I was in the Galapagos of Ecuador. And there I met a group of young Israelis. We were scuba diving, and I needed a group to go with, and it was, turns out it was 4 Israelis, young Israelis, doing their tiyul after IDF. And one of the things that I realized, and I'm a social psychologist, so I'm hypersensitive to this, is that these young people were in some ways lost souls, that their army service had done something. It had taken something out of their souls. I also realized that this is the generation, the current Chayalim who are now in their late 20s, are the generations who grew up during the Intifada and a really terrible set of circumstances. And I think this issue, we need to put it on the table. How difficult people psychologically have had, what the implications of that, and I turned it into, well, what is our responsibility collectively as a community to connect? Obviously, my son doesn't have the same experience of these people, and what can we do as a community to support particularly the next generation who have had this set of experiences.
But just one point, I know someone mentioned the Mifgashim on Birthright, which is, I'm on the board of Birthright, and when I speak to kids that has participated in Birthright, the highlight of the experience was really the Mifgashim, the meeting of the Israelis. That's what they fall in love. They fall in love with the country, but what makes the real connection is the people.
Sure.
And I think that what we as a community can bring here is we spend so much money, which we need to keep doing, sending everyone that we can to Israel, because that's the best way to connect them to their roots and to the state of Israel. But we have a community here that when they come back, we can keep the relationship and the connection to Israel through the Israeli-American community.
I would like to try and sum it up just a little bit, even though we've touched a very big and heavy issue. And thank you for sharing your story that kind of taken the entire conversation toward it. Things that were for decades a given in the relationship between Israel and Jewish communities are now starting to be challenged and to shift. And the younger generation, as you emphasized, are experiencing to a harder extent, to a harsher extent, and they have challenges that maybe their parents, maybe my parents, didn't have to deal with. And in the middle of this entire shifting relationship, we have the Israeli-American as a very unique community that maybe and potentially speaks both languages that can serve as a bridge in this shifting, challenged relationship today. We're actually going to double click on this issue on 2:30 session, Tribal Divisions, if you're interested in talking more about it, and we're going to have Barry there. We're going to talk about it to a larger extent. And I think, do you want to comment something?
I just wanted to go back to the question that you were about to ask before we went to the audience, which is, what's my vision for the future? What should this relationship look like in 30 years? And I think one of the things that I feel very deeply is we're going to end up in exactly the same place. In other words, if we fail as an American Jewish community, we will bring down the Israeli Jewish community as well. If the Israeli Jewish community fails, we will all be failing, because we all end up in the same place. We're all influenced by the world around us. Assimilation is a driving force. Either we figure out how we're going to deal with this, or we mutually fail. So my positive vision is a vision that's driven by strong love of the Jewish people, driven by the mifgash that we have with Israelis through Birthright and many other places. It's also filled with spirituality. It's filled with love of the Jewish people. It's filled with love of Israel. And that means we're going to have strong institutions, whatever you want to call them. They say the next generation doesn't want institutions of any kind. Baloney. Sooner or later, we will need each other. We will need to meet in places with love and with affection and with a vision of the Jewish future, which is dynamic and beautiful and committed not only to the Jewish people, but to social justice. It's what we were put on earth for. And I think that while the Israeli Jewish community and the American Jewish community, we will lose some part of our future. And some part of our future will be intact no matter what. But we're looking at like 35 to 50% where what we do will make a difference. In other words, to go back to Rabbi Soloveitchik, we are not the prisoners of our fate. We define our own destiny, and that's what we need to do together.
We have time for one more question before the final note, so Mike, please.
Thank you. I want to pick up on Shawn's comment about the second generation of Israeli Americans that come here. They're not going to be as connected to Israel. I sometimes worry about the third generation, because studies that I've seen show that second generation is not as connected to Israel. Third generation is not as connected at all, if at all, to Judaism. What can we do about that?
So it's a great point. And I always say, if you just worry about your kids' future, you're not doing enough. You need to think about at least your grandkids' future, because that means you're going to invest much more in your kids' ability to transfer what you give them. So I agree with you as far as you hope that if they don't keep their connection to Israel, at least they keep their connection to Judaism. But like Barry said, I think that I 100% agree that if the Jewish American community failed, there will not be Israeli American community. And it's connecting to Israel too. I think that if, God forbid, there will be any issues that Israel is not there, I think the Jewish American community will have major issues in surviving. So how we as all, not just as Israeli American, as Jewish Americans, on that we share the same challenge. How do we ensure that we invest not just in the next generation? So you have to dig much deeper and invest much more, and sometimes it's not just money.
So to invoke a little Einstein into the conversation, straight lines don't always explain things. And I think we shouldn't assume that everything goes in a straight line, that there's a decline or that there's an increase. In fact, in America, with American Jews, young Jews, the current generation of young American Jews is much more connected to Israel, much more connected to their Judaism than their parents. They look more like their grandparents than their parents. And it has to do with the social changes that were going on in America in the 60s and the 70s, the early part of the 80s. So, and I say this because we shouldn't feel like at any point in time we should give up. We need to keep on educating people and trying to engage people. And that's why these efforts, the ISC's efforts in particular, are so critical at this moment in time.
We have last question before the final note.
It's not a question, it's more a comment. I mean, all the points, it's a great point. When I used to teach for 30 years, and I was director of Sunday school, and I would try to recruit Israeli parents to bring the kids to school. And the attitude was, be Israeli, we know everything. And basically, if I had Israeli students in the school, they didn't know grammar, they didn't know any connection to Judaism, they just came. But I think education has to start from home when the kid's young. I know we do a lot for the teenagers, for later on, but we need to start doing also for the younger kids because it starts from when you're young. Then you have the roots first.
So where do you live?
We need to add maybe something more for educate parents, young parents, to teach the children from very young age. I'm not saying it's too late when you're older. I'm not saying that, but you have to also start when the kid's young to have the connection, to have identity in the beginning.
Where do you live?
I'm sorry.
Where do you live currently?
I live in Jacksonville, Florida.
Okay. Where the IC programs range from 1-year-old to 100-year-old.
I'm not saying it.
No, I'm saying I completely agree with you. And we need to ensure the Israeli American community and the Jewish American community that we get the kids engaged and involved from the beginning, not trying to catch up later.
I think there's an agreement.
Because I know in my country, in my city, we don't have that.
So we need to talk because the IC is doing things where we don't have offices, and we have the Biyachad program, which can give you all the resources.
Perfect. In a few minutes, we're leaving for a lunch break, and then you have the chance to catch up with Shawn. So you have to go to the mic because even us can hear you.
That younger generation that you described, Dr. Saxe, as being identical or closest to their grandparents, can you define their ages for us, please?
I'm talking about the millennial generation, so people who are currently 18 to 38, 39, 40, something like that.
Okay. I would like to ask our speakers now to give their final note. I asked them to share their positive vision towards the successful integration of Israeli Americans here within the Jewish community. I think Mr. Shrage had shared some. If you'd like to add anything else, that's the time. And if not, we can continue with Mr. Rakitt.
I think everything's been said, and everyone has already said it, so there's no more to add.
Now we just need to do it.
Now we just need to do it.
First of all, Diana to Barry's vision, I think it's a beautiful one. I think mine is that we drop the words next generation, stop behaving as if we know what's best for them, and help that younger cohort, 18 to 34 is the way I define it, to make decisions that are both self-empowering and forward-looking, because they will make the future what they need to make that future. And I don't think any of us can predict what's going to be in 30 years, except that if we have the current generation define what's important to them, then they will do that. I also think that by the time we get to the third generation of Israeli Americans, either the IAC will need to change its charter, it may go out of business, because by then you have American Jews, or not. And the connection to Israel from that first generation of immigrant family to the second generation will be lost by the third generation. So I'm not suggesting we begin long-range planning right now, but I am suggesting that the nature of this conversation is going to change significantly.
Nothing specific to add except thank you for the questions. Thank you for the questions, and I hope that having this conversation promotes the goal that I think we all share.
So the IC today is, if you look at all our programs, we're not catered to Israeli Americans only. I'll give you just one example, Eitanim, which is the high school program. It's 50% American Jews and 50% Israeli Americans. A lot of our programs are going this way because we understand if we want to beat the breach, we need to do it actively inside. And I think the main issue we all need to remember, we need to have more of this discussion, but we need to stop using the term we and them. In the Jewish community, and I wish it would be done across America, it's like us, we as Americans, we are as Jews. That's the terms we need to use, because when you use the terms us and them, and I hear it in different panels, especially from people that came from Israel, it's that there is no us and them. We are too small to have us and them. So I'll just end with that.
I want to ask a question, but I disagree with you. And I think it's important because we are different. We come from Israel, we are different Israelis, we are different characterized, and that's one of the most, very important issues.
So I'll answer it very simple.
We have to educate ourselves. The Jewish American have to understand it, and we have to understand it. And that's one of the biggest issues. If we don't realize it, we don't solve the real problem. And we have to start with that. And this is something that we have to address.
No. So I touched it very in the beginning about the communication and open, but you know what? I'm married. My wife is here. We are not the same, but it's an us. It's not she and me. So we have to first think that we are together in this mission, because as long as we keep saying that, you know, it's them and us, or we are better, or they are better, but I completely agree with you that we need to do a lot of work within us, and the IC has been doing it, because look what happened before the IC and after the IC, how we are able to do more integration, because we concentrate on certain things. But now that we have been 10 years in action, we don't need just to concentrate on that. It's not that the IC will become a Jewish American organization, then there is no need for the IC, because then we'll just be another federation or another Jewish organization.
Yeah, we have to highlight the difference.
I think that subject was discussed
We need to embrace
at the beginning of this
differences.
session quite extensively, and there is no disagreement here. As the Israeli women on this fantastic session, I would like to conclude with a story. I was a child at elementary school when Israel had experienced a very important integration challenge. And of course, I'm referring to the integration of the Russian Aliyah, the Russian immigrants, into the state of Israel, that quite caught us in the middle of elementary school. It was a weird phenomenon for us as Israelis at first. But I think, looking almost 20 years in retrospective, it was a very unique and important integration process that wasn't easy, but gave the Israeli society some very important cultural assets. And one of them has to do with the song I presented at the beginning of the session. Leah Goldberg, the creator of Pine Trees, the song about the two homelands, has another song called Ten Male Kochavim, a basket full of stars. And there's a very talented singer, Israeli singer, called Marina Maximilian Blumin. Have you heard about her? Mm-hmm. She's terrific. And she gave it a new melody. And then in the middle of the song, she's changing the language and translating the song into the mother tongue of Leah Goldberg, into Russian. Marina and Leah mother tongue. And I think this song quite consolidates and crystallized a process that the Israeli society had been through. And I think it echoes some of the challenges and values that the integration process of the Israeli American here are going through now. I feel very proud and happy to be here, standing on this stage, being a part of this process. I want to thank to our speakers for your work and for being with us today. I want to thank you for being with us here in this panel. Enjoy your lunch break, and we'll see you later.
Great work.